All right. So my name is Dan Quinn, corn agronomist, assistant professor and corn agronomist here at Purdue. And I'll also introduce Darcy, who's with me as well.
Yep. So Darcy Telenko, extension plant pathologist at Purdue, and here to back up Dan as we talk about this.
Yep. So the title of our talk is Foliar disease control impacts on corn grain fill duration and kernel weight accumulation in corn. And I'll jump right in. And one thing that I often present when I give a lot of presentations in terms of just corn management in general is just kind of taking a step back and looking at just overall yield components and how yield is determined and formed in corn. And also understanding that, a lot of these components are developed throughout the entire season. I think this kind of leads into where we're going with some of this information, and also kind of gives a perspective of where we wanted to look in terms of, not only just looking at grain yield as a whole with disease control, but actually what specific components are impacted when we control disease in corn. So, the first thing is that corn yield components are really developed throughout the entire season. They start with, one of the first main components is just the number of yield producing plants. So your final harvest population up until about the V6 growth stage, 18 to 20 inch tall corn. Then we move into, the more rapid growth phase in corn when you see that really rapid vegetative growth. What's interesting about this portion is that the corn plants are determining how big their ears are going to be. So this is more so of when that corn plant's determining what the potential kernel number is going to be. So potential row number and potential kernels per row. So even before you can visually see that ear, that corn plant is starting to determine how big its ear is going to be. You think about pollination. Pollination is so critical for corn. Period. Corn is really sensitive during this period of time from all sorts of stressors. Predominantly water stress, nutrient stress, disease stress. This is often the growth stage that corn has the highest percent yield loss per day when we have certain stressors in corn. But a lot of that yield component aspect is specific to actual kernel number per ear. So earlier this was potential kernel number. Now we're determining actual kernel number, and a lot of that has to do with both pollination success and kernel survival. And then lastly, really the last yield component and what we look at and where kind of this presentation is going to focus some, and where some of the research that we've looked at this a little bit more intensively is actually kernel weight. So getting into the later reproductive stages, R2, R3, all the way to physiological maturity in corn. Corn is really looking at yield in terms of the size and the weight and the amount of dry matter in these kernels, or that grain filling period. So this was an area, a specific yield component that we wanted to look at a little bit further when it comes to foliar disease control and yield improvement in corn. So, overall, corn is yield is a very complex process. We do a lot, especially on my side in agronomy realm, to understand and keep improving corn yield. But it really boils down to how do we optimize kernel number per unit area, and how do we optimize kernel weight. And there's a lot of trade-offs between, if kernel weight is increased, a lot of times we see lower kernel numbers increase per ear. We also see kernel weight. So there's an inverse relationship between those two, but trying to understand both of them and how we can improve both of them at the same time is important. And a lot of that has to do with, reducing yield limiting factors throughout the season, right? And there's a lot of yield limiting factors, a lot of stressors that we have to address and manage for. And the one we'll largely focus on today is foliar disease in corn. So I share this a little bit further in terms of the table. Some of this work was data from our own program. Some of it's actually out of Iowa State University as well. But I feel this table, looking at late reproductive stages, so R5 would be dent all the way to physiological maturity. This is just estimated kernel moisture at that point in time. So you think about, as corn approaches physiological maturity, that moisture in that grain is decreasing all the way to harvest. But we often look at this specific column here, just looking at dry matter, or what the percent of total dry weight, dry starch, dry matter in that kernel. And also showing that even at dent, which is pretty progressed in terms of reproductive stages, only about 45% of that kernel dry matter has been achieved. So that shows you that even, stressors that are, R3, R4 leading into R5 can still impact grain yield as well. And a lot of it has to do with, not only grain fill duration, but just the size and weight of those kernels. Yield bushels per acre is a volumetric measurement, but farmers are going to be paid off of weight per acre. So this just illustrates again, the stressors in those late reproductive stages can still impact yield. A lot of that has to do with the specific weight of those kernels. And then we also have, the growing degree days between these individual stages, and also the estimated number of days between each one of those stages. So now I'll let Darcy take over here.
Yep. And so the other aspect of this is just asking, what is the foliar disease impact on yield? And what I did here is just pull the overall estimated yield losses across the United States and Canada for foliar diseases in corn. And you can kind of see since 2015, there's a general trend downward, as we get hybrids with good disease resistance packages, our risk towards those diseases does seem to decline. But you can see there are points in this tracking since 2012 that we have outbreaks, right? So 2018 and 2021, that's where we got hit really hard with tar spot or other foliar diseases that may impact yield. And you can kind of see on 2024. Again, each year to year is going to depend on the environmental conditions for the foliar diseases, on which disease may appear in that crop canopy and also lead to that potential loss in yield. So if we tease it apart, particularly here in Indiana, I think there are 4 important diseases that we track that can impact yields in the full upper canopy. One being gray leaf spot, I would say, is the one that is most predominant across the state and been a disease we've been tracking for a long period of time. Generally, gray leaf spot, we get good management at that, applying a fungicide at that VTR1 stage for protecting yields against that disease. Northern corn leaf blight can appear in pockets, so it's important to understand if you've had a history of that disease, if you can select hybrids that may have better disease resistance for that. Lately, in this last year, southern rust has been a big concern in 2025. So that is a disease, we track, and I'll get into a little bit more in each one specifically, but how soon southern rust moves into the state is going to dictate the potential yield impacts of that disease. And then finally, a disease that I've been dealing with a lot is the tar spot. And then for protecting the canopy from tar spot, our window is a little wider than that standard VTR1 fungicide application. We may want to go a little later since this disease really seems to move in after that R3 timeframe. And so if we just pull out each disease, just trying to explore what's happening across the United States and Canada, you can kind of see the yield losses for southern rust, where we have fluctuations of whenever that disease moves in. The good news on southern rust is it does not overwinter here in the United States. So every year we start with a clean slate. And the question is, when do those spores move into your particular area? You can kind of see what the map looked like for 2025. So it started in the South in Texas and Florida, moved into those southern states in Mississippi, Arkansas. And then actually, if we had the animated map, it actually jumped over to Nebraska. There was a county that turned on before it really blew across Iowa and into Indiana. But again, when we found it here in Indiana, it was about middle of July. So there was some concern if it could blow up and cause some yield losses again, but it's just a disease we're tracking, and to be informed when it blows in, whether we need to change our management tools for that or apply a fungicide that's directed for southern rust versus the other diseases. Again, gray leaf spots generally around everywhere. You can kind of see it has a general decline in disease. We maybe had an outbreak in 2018, but generally we can use hybrids with good disease packages for gray leaf spots, so we don't have to rely as heavily on our fungicides. But most of our work continues to show that an application at that silking R1 timeframe is really good for managing gray leaf spot. And then finally, tar spot. Again, a disease that we didn't really see any yield impacts until 2018. We did first document it in 2015 here in the United States, so it's now been around over 10 years. This disease is highly influenced by environmental conditions. And so year to year, it's important to monitor where we see disease active, and then are the environmental conditions conducive for the disease to develop. And for Indiana and some of the work we've done, what we're seeing is we need moderate temperatures in that May to June timeframe and with high moisture conditions for those spores to germinate. If the temperatures get too hot and dry, then we'll slow down this disease and it may not have those yield impacts that's had previous years. So again, it kind of changes year to year whether this disease is going to be a problem, but again, it is here and may influence how well our fungicides work.
So, where we started to go with some of the recent research was, understanding, and you can kind of see it with some of the photos and information that Darcy shared, is that, one thing with corn and foliar disease, right? If we have foliar disease, that's limiting a lot of the green leaf tissue. It's taking over a lot of the green leaf tissue in corn, and so it's reducing some of that photosynthetic activity and capacity of that plant later in the season. So sometimes what we'll see with fungicides is just an impact of stay green potential, and a lot of that's just keeping that plant healthier later in the season, controlling some of that disease. So we wanted to understand that if we are seeing foliar disease control, if we're seeing some aspects of just healthier plants later in the season because we're controlling that disease, right? How does this impact both grain fill duration and kernel weight in corn? A lot of it has to do with, okay, if we control foliar disease, we see yield improvements in corn, but where specifically are some of those yield improvements coming from a yield component and physiological aspect with the plant? And that's where this recent publication in Crop Science really highlights some of this work and what I'm going to go through here over the next few slides. So, one aspect before I show some of the data is just helping people understand just the overall grain filling process in corn and overall grain fill duration and also where we were going with some of this research. Here's a good example from a study that was published out of Kansas State here, just kind of highlighting, that overall process. You look at on this figure here, we have days after flowering, we have kernel dry weight. You typically start with the kernel growth or the lag phase. So the lag phase is really starting to determine, okay, what is that kernel's volume capacity at that point in time. Then we have the linear kernel filling rate. Linear kernel filling rate is really when kernels are filling with water content. There also is a point in time where we're starting to determine what that total kernel volume is. We see this, being impacted just with genetics today, period. Hybrids today have actually a longer linear kernel filling rate, period, than they used to. They actually have a longer kernel grain fill duration today than what they used to. And then eventually we're going to hit a maximum point and reach physiological maturity or black layer in the corn. So a lot of this research and data I'll show is just understanding, if we are able to control foliar disease, maybe have a little bit healthier plant later in the season, how does that impact this overall trend or this overall process, right? How does it impact both the duration period, but also the maximum kernel dry weight in corn as well? So just some examples of how we approached this. So we actually had ear samples from each plot of each study. We had studies in West Lafayette, Northwest Indiana, and Southwest Indiana. A lot of this intensive sampling was done in West Central Indiana, West Lafayette, for a couple of years. We actually pre-marked these plants. So these plants were pre-marked early in the growing season, and so that we were able to determine which plants we're going to sample from. And then we pulled ears starting about 1 to 2 weeks after pollination. We pulled ears every single week. So starting when ears were, kernels were very, very small, and we're determining, okay, what is the moisture content, what is the wet weight, and then what is the dry weight of those kernels. And we're doing that on a weekly basis to understand that full grain fill duration. Here's just some examples of some ears that we pulled from this research trial. We were actually pulling kernels from the center of the ears to just try and get a consistent kernel size in those ears, but doing it on a weekly basis from every plot, from every replication, to see how trial or plots that had a fungicide application. So the fungicide was applied at R1 versus plots that did not have fungicide application. So we track kernel moisture, we track kernel weight, dry matter, water content, and then that data allows us to look at, okay, what is the maximum dry weight in those kernels achieved, but also what is the grain fill duration, and then how does that differ between when I have a fungicide application or when I have foliar disease control versus when I don't. So here's just some examples of some of the research trials in this study, just giving you an example of some of the disease levels that we had. It did vary based on location, but the majority of I think all of the locations that we did this study in, we did have foliar disease in these research trials. This is from Southeast Indiana. So we took measurements in Southeast Indiana, looking at kernel dry weight and then looking at foliar disease ratings. This is my grad student, Milena, who led this project. Just showing you, some of the examples, the intensive plots were ones that had a foliar fungicide application at R1. You can see the difference just in ear leaves, right? These are ear leaves pulled when we had no fungicide application versus when we did in Southeast Indiana in 2022. Here's just some overall visual differences as well between the plots, kind of showing you again some of that stay green aspect when we have that foliar disease control. We'll see this, with nutrition and moisture and temperature and aspects like that. But these plots were side by side in this research trial. So same location, same plots. The only difference that we had is that we had a fungicide application at R1 on the plots here. And then this was a controlled, where we had kind of our standard management, standard fertility management, standard seeding rate management, but no additional disease control in these plots. And this is right near physiological maturity when those images were taken. So you can kind of see the overall difference and just plant color when you get later in the season, when we're able to control some of the diseases versus when we're not. And then this is from West Lafayette in 2023. So saw similar responsiveness across a lot of our trials. We're able to control some of those stressors. We see that plant kind of maintain some of its photosynthetic health a little bit later in the season versus when we're not able to control some of those stressors. So control on the left-hand side, then a fungicide application on the right. So I'll jump right in and just show some of the data, the grain fill duration and kernel weight data. This was from West Lafayette in 2022. You can see we have kernel dry weight here. So this is dry weight in milligrams per individual kernel on the left-hand side. And then we have days after silking or days after that R1 growth stage. So you can see we probably took it about 2 weeks after silking. We started sampling. Blue is without R1 fungicide, red is with the R1 fungicide. Everything else in the plots and the treatments were treated the exact same way, whether it be fertility, hybrid, seeding rate, planting date, all of those aspects. So the only difference was if we had fungicide or not. You can see we started sampling the grain on a weekly basis, and we're sampling that grain until we start to see this plateau occur or that maximum dry matter occurring. It's not so much that the plant has reached physiological maturity, but it's the point where we're just not seeing any more accumulation of dry weight in the kernels. So one thing we did notice is that actually the linear filling rate was not different. So the slopes were actually the exact same way. But what we did notice when we had some foliar disease control is that grain fill duration actually went a little bit longer. So without the disease control, it took about 50 days post silking to reach maximum dry matter in those kernels, about 270 milligrams per grain. When we were able to control some of that disease, it actually went a little bit longer, so about 4 days longer to 54 days to reach that maximum point here. And then you can see that when grain fill duration is extended, it actually keeps increasing. So when we're able to extend that grain fill, then we see a little bit higher kernel dry matter in those kernels. And in many cases, that leads to higher yield across the board when you look at a per acre basis. So here's some of the overall numbers. I would say, even with the foliar disease, we still had relatively low levels in 2022. This is actually a combination of tar spot, northern core leaf blight, and gray leaf spot. Probably gray leaf spot, northern core leaf blight were the main diseases in this site. but we did see a yield improvement. But overall, relatively lower disease severity, lower yields as well in 2022, lower productivity for us at this location. But it just shows the evidence of, hey, that, when we can maintain some of this plant health, we're seeing that grain field duration get extended a little bit longer. And then we'll jump to 2023. So 2023 actually was a much more productive year period. It also was a year that we had higher disease levels as well. So just in terms of higher productivity, we had a higher grain field duration period, even when you just compare the controls in 23 versus 2022. But overall, same story, right? We have kernel dry weight in terms of milligrams per individual kernel. We have days after silking here. Again, you can see the slope or that rate of kernel dry weight accumulation is very similar, regardless of fungicide application. Control took about 56 days, so actually about 6 days longer in 2023 versus 2022 period. But you can see the overall kernel dry weight was much higher in 23 than 22. But the rate was very similar. Response was pretty similar as 2023. We saw a little bit more pronounced response in 2023 than 2022, and I think that had to do with just elevated disease pressure in 23 than 22. But overall, we found that, when we were able to control that foliar disease, we saw about 5 days longer of grain field duration. And when you see that extension, that line keeps going up. So we see that improvement on a per kernel basis of seeing a little bit heavier kernels at that point in time. Here's the overall yield, about a 10 bushel difference between the control and the fungicide, a little bit higher disease. Again, this is foliar disease percentage at that R5 growth stage. I know our tar spot severity was a little bit higher, but also had gray leaf spot and northern corn leaf blight in 23 as well. But seeing that, reduction in foliar disease percentage on that R5 year leaf, relating to yield, but also relating to that grain field duration. So just some take home points on this research trial is that, one, the first thing is that corn develops grain yield via different components throughout the entire plant life cycle. I always stress with folks that yield is not made at, one day or one point in time during the growing season. There's a lot of components and aspects to it. And that corn develops yield in different ways throughout the entire season, whether it be number of plants, number of harvestable ears, kernel number, ear size, okay, actual kernel number, and then we get into kernel dry weight as well. So there's all aspects throughout the entire season and that we have to pay attention to, but also in ways that corn plant can be impacted negatively from a yield standpoint. With this research trial, right, we did see that, being able to control the foliar disease with a well-timed fungicide application at R1, it was just one application at that silking stage, did have the potential to extend corn grain field duration. And then when we're able to extend that grain field duration, we see that the kernel weight increases, and kernel weight increases on a per kernel basis, then we see that overall yield response. But I do always stress that, with this research trial, we did have conditions that were conducive for response. We did have foliar disease across all the site years of doing this trial. I always get asked, hey, did you see this without disease period? And I can't answer that because we had disease across these trials. And that was one of the bigger stressors that we saw, especially in 2023 with this research trial. And then, lastly, I think, if we're able to control foliar disease, it's able to maintain some of that late season plant health, some of that late season plant photosynthetic activity and capacity, which is improvement is critical for improving corn grain field and yield. And it's not just fungicide, right? It's not just foliar disease control. It's just stress in general. If that plant is maintaining its health, it's maintaining its photosynthetic activity later in the season, and doesn't have something that is, negating that or reducing that, in many ways that grain fill duration is going to extend, right? We have seen this, and there's a lot of other research that's been published in terms of plant nutrition. You think about nitrogen levels, right? We see very similar responses with nitrogen. We see very similar responses with temperature. Typically cooler temperatures result in an extended grain fill duration, where that plant's not, working as hard later in the season. We see that with moisture as well. If you have drought conditions later in the season, that's going to impact grain fill duration and shorten that grain fill. So it's not just the fungicide that's doing this, and not just foliar disease control. There's other aspects to it that can impact grain fill duration and kernel weight accumulation. Now I'll let Darcy wrap up here.
Yep. And so what we just wanted to share is there are a number of tools that are available as we talk about foliar disease management in corn. And the first one I want to direct you to is the crop risk tool. And you may have heard of the Tar Spotter app. Well, this has all been moved to one nice centralized website on the Crop Protection Network. And so what I'm showing here is I've gone in and selected the risk for tar spot across the state of Indiana from last year. And so this is a nice tool to just give you an idea of the environmental conditions been conducive for the disease and help predict whether we need to, make a fungicide application if the disease risk is high, in addition to what Dan has presented. But just a nice little tool that kind of track the season. In season, we do have a forecast that's going out 5 days. So you can kind of see as the trend, are we trending where we're going to be in a high risk period where we're red in that area, or is the risk going down? Just some additional tools to look at. So this has the crop risk tool has tar spot modeling available. It also has a gray leaf spot model and a gibberella model. So there's some 3 tools that are available for looking at corn foliar disease risk. In addition, as you're trying to make that assessment and try to determine what fungicide you may want to use, we do have a fungicide efficacy table. We are currently in the process of updating it now, and hopefully a new one will be released next month or so in February. But that table is available for foliar diseases in corn, and you can cross-reference if what disease is of most concern on your farm. There are some different ratings for southern rust versus tar spot and gray leaf spot. In addition, they've taken this table and we've put it into a tool that you can search products and different modes of action to see what rating it gets for the particular disease of concern. So just another tool that can help you make an informed decision on what fungicide product you want. And in addition to that, and I think, Dan, you can click one more time, we have an ROI calculator. So here's a summary. We have crop disease forecasting, fungicide efficacy tool, and then there's an ROI calculator for foliar diseases in corn, and then also white mold and soybean. But just another tool that you can go in and play with. You can put in your expected yield, and based on our university data, you can make an assessment of, what's the potential ROI if I use this particular product, and what's the likelihood what are the odds of making that ROI? And so just a neat little tool to make you informed decision. Some things I, would recommend as we move into 2026 monitoring, just to get an idea of, are the diseases going to be active? What products do we want to pick from? And, is there potential ROI on using that product? So just some nice tools to help with disease management. And these, of course, are always available at the Crop Protection Network. So a nice resource.
I will follow up and say that I use these tools regularly. So even the questions that I get, I use the fungicide efficacy tool all the time. I use the ROI tool, the tracking, the modeling sort of tool, even from an agronomist standpoint. These tools we use all the time. I use them all the time in making decisions and helping a lot of our farmers around the state. And then, we'll wrap up and share, obviously we appreciate working with Crop Protection Network and being able to share this information. We like the Indiana Corn Marketing Council, so our state checkoff dollars, we're supportive of a lot of this research. And then I do have to highlight, the pretty new Corn Outreach and Research Network, which is a new multi-state corn agronomist network that really started in 2025. So you'll start to see a lot of us here populate in terms of working with Crop Protection Network and working on getting a lot more information on the agronomic side, but also partnering with Crop Protection Network to be able to share a lot of this information moving forward. So be on the lookout of a lot more information coming from that group here in 2026.